Okay. Okay. Here we go, guys. Well, let's jump in. And thanks, Cade. And really excited to talk today about knowing your numbers. And so this is one of the key components of health is if you're looking to move into having better energy, more vitality, and just feeling better overall, biggest thing you need to focus on right out of the gates is getting your blood sugar regulated, because a lot of us, we have these our days where we have high energy and maybe too high, we get kind of amped up and then our energy levels tank. And so what we're going to talk about today is knowing your numbers when it comes to blood sugar, and we're going to talk about 3 critical numbers. Now, the first number let's dive into is going to be your glucose. And so your blood glucose is a critical marker, because one of the things it helps us understand is how much of the sugar that you've consumed is actually getting out of your blood and into your cells, because you want to use glucose as quickly as possible. The mitochondria in your cells, they love to just use that glucose as an energy source. And if it's floating around in your blood, that means you're getting more inflammation. And it's one of the predictive numbers and predictive markers for any chronic disease. There was a study that was released in the Journal of Diabetes that said that high blood sugar or low blood sugar dysregulation, or being a dysglycemic is the medical term. If you're dysglycemic, that can contribute to almost any chronic disease on the planet. So what are your numbers, and how many of you actually know what your numbers are? Because you can go buy a kit at any local pharmacy and do this yourself. It's very simple. So one of the things you look at is anything under 100 on your glucose is considered normal. If you test, and this is a fasting blood sugar test, if you test 101 to 126, that's considered pre-diabetic. And this is not a fun state to be in. Anything over 126 is considered diabetic. And so where we want you to be with your fasting blood sugar is we want you to be between 75 and 94. That's a sweet spot. So right in the 80s is you want to be stuck in the 80s. That's actually a good thing in the blood sugar world, to get stuck in the 80s. Cade knows exactly how that feels. He's worn the headbands. He's had the jean jacket. So we'll get him stuck in the 80s. All right, hemoglobin A1C, we're going to jump into that. But first of all, when you're testing your fasting blood sugar, that means you want to go at least 8 hours with no food. What's even better is if you go a full 12 hours, because it takes about 12 hours for all of the glycogen that gets stored in your liver to get fully metabolized. That's why when you'll hear me talk a lot on the time-restricted eating, give yourself at least a 12-hour window every day where you're not eating any type of food, to fully let your liver process all of the sugars in your body. And you'll feel so much better. Hemoglobin A1C is what we're going to jump into next. But first of all, I want to hear how many of you have actually tested your blood sugar and actually know what your fasting blood sugar levels end up being, because I think it's critical to know this. I remember at the Go Wellness event a couple of years ago, I was doing my own personal test, and I was shocked to find that my numbers, my glucose numbers, were higher than what I anticipated. And it sent me on this journey of really trying to uncover what was causing this. And I got my gut profile in, and I learned that I was low in a bacteria called Akkermansia. And I started researching it, and I said, okay, Akkermansia, they love garlic, onions. I can't eat onions. I've always had a sensitivity to onions. They thrash my stomach. and give me really bad breath. And so, so what I did is I learned that acromantia can be fueled by just really fasting. And that was it. And so I started fasting, lost about 15 pounds within the first 30 days, just felt great, got my blood sugar nice and polished, and it's been that way ever since. But if I didn't know, I could have gone on for years and ended up, pre-diabetic, diabetic. It could have been very severe, as you'll learn what this disease can actually do in your body. So what is hemoglobin A1C? Now, I think that's something that we all look at, and someone on Instagram is asking, is that insulin? When we look at blood glucose, that's just blood glucose. And so that was the test where we want your fasting blood glucose to be between 74 and about 94. Stuck in the 80s is the mantra that we're using for your fasting glucose. But then your hemoglobin A1C, where you want this to be is right around 4.9 to 5.4 or 5.0 to 5.3. And so all hemoglobin A1C is it takes the volume of your total blood, and what happens is the glucose sticks to the red blood cells. And that glucose will stay stuck to that red blood cell for as long as that red blood cell is living. And so it will travel with the red blood cell. And red blood cells tend to live to be about 3 months. And so this is where you can get a much better average what your blood sugar levels are. And so next time you guys are in at the clinic here in Salt Lake, we have a hemoglobin A1C machine. It's very easy for us to do a simple test. It's just a simple spot of blood, and then we can see what your levels look like. Very key to your overall health. So if you look at hemoglobin A1C, what you want to do is you want to continually looking at this. And so we like to get kind of a 3-month picture. And so we'll test it once, and then 3 months down the road, we'll test it again. And so this is critical for just seeing overall health, the overall health of your blood sugar and how well your body is absorbing the sugar, utilizing it. Is it too high? Is it too low? Both of these are pretty critical components, because if you think about how you feel when you've got no, the test, I'll answer that question. The test does not have to be in a fasted state unless you're doing a fasting glucose. But if you're doing hemoglobin A1C, you can show up at any time and we do the test. Very simple. Let's talk about C-Peptide, because it's easy to get stuck on your fasting glucose or your hemoglobin A1C. And these are important markers. The other one that we test is a marker called insulin, so we can actually see how well your pancreas is producing insulin. And then the fourth one is called C-Peptide. And C-Peptide is very critical. It shows up in your blood tests. And for those of you who've had your blood test with us or with another clinic recently, you can pull your labs out and actually look at what your C-Peptide markers are. Because what C-Peptide shows is how well your pancreas, not only that it's releasing insulin, but how well that insulin's being utilized. And so this is critical because in type 1 diabetes, what happens is your beta cells in your pancreas stop producing insulin. And that's a very dangerous place to be, because if your beta cells aren't producing insulin, then what happens is you can't get the sugar from the blood into your cells. And so when sugar stays in the blood, that's where you get the spikes and wanes in your blood sugar, causes a lot of inflammation, and that's where your body really starts to feel like crap. And that's where you can get hangry. You can really start getting emotional. People do really funny things when their blood sugars aren't balanced. And so I think there's a Snickers bar that says like hangry, and there's a whole commercial around that, isn't there, Cade? It's a pretty funny one. And yeah, Cade's been hungry a few times, so I've seen him hangry. It's all good. So if you look at the other thing is called type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes is typically when your pancreas is still secreting enough insulin, but the problem is your cells become insulin resistant. And what insulin does is it carries glucose into the cells. And then the cells can use that glucose as energy. But If you have insulin resistance, that means that the insulin's knocking on the door saying, hey, we got sugar for you. And your cells are like, no way, we don't want any more sugar. Please do not bring any more sugar into my life. And so what happens is then that sugar gets converted to a fatty acid, triglyceride, which can be very toxic and cause more inflammation. And so that's type 2 diabetes. The other type is type 1.5 diabetes, and this is where you can actually have both. You can have type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes where the beta cells in your pancreas are not functional, so you're not producing enough insulin. But then you can also have type 2 where even when you put the exogenous insulin into your body, the receptor sites on your cells won't take that sugar in from the insulin. So your cells just basically have quit responding to insulin because the whole goal is creating insulin sensitivity. And by the way, you do not have to have insulin to use glucose from the cells. That's where you've got your GLUT4 receptors. And those GLUT4 receptors can actually utilize glucose from the cells if you've been exercising more, even if you've been really active. Building muscle mass is another way you can do that. And so one of the things we want to look at in your testing is looking at your C-peptide. So what happens with the C-peptide? This is a protein that's attached to insulin. And then once insulin becomes activated, that C-peptide is cleaved off and floats around in the bloodstream. And so ideally your C-peptide should be 1 to 5, but you don't want it to be below 1. If it's below 1, what that means is your insulin is just kind of floating in the bloodstream. And as it's floating in the bloodstream, it's not being utilized. So that means you're insulin resistance. And so it's very interesting to look at your C-peptide. A lot of doctors out there, all they look at hemoglobin A1C and glucose, fasting glucose, and they don't really look at the C-peptide, but the C-peptide actually helps us understand how actively utilized your insulin is. So very critical markers for those of you who've had it. So what happens is the beta cells, they make the insulin, and when the insulin goes active to dormant, that's when the C-peptide is cleaved off, and now it's shown as a byproduct of insulin being activated. And so C-peptide, if you have C-peptide in your blood, anywhere from, once again, 1 to 5, that means your beta cells are working and you're making insulin. So very critical component. Just to recap your fasting glucose levels, if you're pre-diabetic, it's going to be 100 to 125. If you look at the 2-hour plasma glucose, this means you do the challenge test where you take in a bunch of sugar, which is kind of a brutal way of really getting a handle on your glucose, but actually really critical. That if you are technically pre-diabetic if you're 140 to 199. And so this is, you drink the challenge drink, and then you look at it 30 minutes later, you look at it an hour later, 2 hours later, and then you want to see there is going to be an initial spike. You just don't want that spike to be too high. And then prediabetes is when your hemoglobin A1C or your A1C is what your doctor may call it is 5.7 to 6.4. And these are all numbers from the American Diabetes Association, but from 2017. Once again, prediabetes is where your doctor will say, well, let's just watch and see what happens. Don't get stuck in that trap, because the worst thing you can do if your blood sugars aren't regulated is just watch and wait. I mean, it's wild when you see this, because if you're watching and waiting, what do you want to, what's got to happen until you completely get derailed? And someone's asking, what do you use for a drink? Well, there's a glucose drink that's got about 50 grams of sugar in it, just straight up glucose that you guzzle, and that's when you can see how sensitive you are to sugar. So yes, it's a powder that you can mix up. It's a juice, and you can get it at pharmacies if you want to be real accurate about it. Or you could probably drink some type of fruit juice that's got about 50 grams of fructose in it. Once again, not recommended. I'd say check your hemoglobin A1C, check your fasting glucose. And don't worry about the challenge right now. Look at your C-peptide. Don't put your body under any undue stress. If we see that the numbers are enough off with your hemoglobin A1C, then we'd say, okay, let's see just how bad it is, and then we'll do the glucose tolerance test. Okay, but anything you look at, Kaiser study, when you look at the importance of this, and we're going to talk about some of the complications of diabetes, so that you guys are like, oh, Reagan's just talking numbers right now. How is this relevant to my health? Well, we're going to dive in just a minute, and you're going to see that there is some relevancy to your overall health, big time. And so if you look at a Kaiser study, what they found is each point about a fasted glucose of 84 increases your risk for developing type 2 diabetes by 6% in the next 9 years. That's why we say we want you stuck in the 80s. And if you're right at the 80, between 80 and 84, that's a good place to be. It's a really good place to be. So if you look at this, Kate, you were born in 1987. Is that right? So Kate's stuck in the 80s. I'm stuck in 78, so I'm a little on the low side, but still room for improvement. But the Kaiser study was very interesting because if you think about it, if your fasting glucose numbers, just if they go up 10 points, every year, if you look at that, that's a 6% chance of an increase. And so you're exponentially increasing your chances of contracting type 2 diabetes in the next 9 years. I remember my kids, this was about 3 or 4 years ago, they went home from school, and what happened is they came home and they're like, oh man, there's this kid at the playground and he fell and he cut his arm open and there's blood everywhere. And I said, well, did you help the kid out? I mean, what did you guys do? And one of my sons, he said, no way, I'm not going to help him out. I might get diabetes. And so they thought that diabetes was actually a contagious disease. And so it's that prevalent in our society. I mean, I was looking at research a couple of years ago, and African Americans, if you look at kids who have diabetes, it's 1 in 4 have diabetes. If you look at Asian Americans, 1 in 4 have diabetes. Our food, our whole healthcare system, and the way that we're eating is really a massive contributor. You look at in Hawaii, their numbers may even be more severe than that. So very, very crazy. So if you look at hemoglobin A1C, 2/3 of individuals in America are walking around and do not have the levels of the hemoglobin A1C that we want. So you are walking around right now and you have no idea that this disease is brewing in your body. And so this is one of the reasons I'm talking about this today, is because it's time that we actually do something different about our health and actually start uncovering what's going on internally. That is one of the best things you can do. So if you look at one of the things that happens as you lower your hemoglobin A1C, well, first of all, deaths related to diabetes drops 21% just by lowering your hemoglobin A1C percentage from if we got it from a 7% to a 6%, you have a 21% you're 21% less likely to die from diabetes. You're 37% less likely to develop microvascular complications, and you're 14% less likely to have a myocardial infarction. So these are huge just by lowering it 1 percentage point. Because if you end up with diabetes, this is where diabetes, the complications are, it's not just the blood sugar. I mean, I have patients all the time who tell me, Regan, my diabetes is under control. I'm taking my medications. My doctor's happy. We got it down to a 7. So it's better than where it was. But I'm saying you're still on medications, and just because you're on diabetic medications does not mean the problem is gone. You're still going to develop these complications because you've got the underlying issue that hasn't been resolved. And so that's one of the things we want to do, is get to the underlying cause and start correcting your blood sugar. And so I'll be going over the next couple of weeks on all the strategic pathways that we've found that will help you reverse diabetes, because some of the complications are diabetic nephropathy. So this kidney disease, peripheral neuropathy, that's a major contributor for those of you who have neuropathy. And I'll be doing a live teaching seminar, talking specifically about neuropathy today at noon. Strokes, it increases your chance of heart attacks, of peripheral arterial disease. That means you have no blood circulation. And if you have peripheral arterial disease, there's a really good chance you're going to have very poor sexual function. And men, you'll have erectile dysfunction. That will be a major setback to your well-being. Diabetic retinopathy, that's another issue. Cataracts, glaucoma, diabetic foot, all these are diabetes complications, and they come from not managing your blood sugar early on and just waiting and watching and saying, well, you're not diabetic yet, let's just wait and see what happens. Well, we're of the mantra, don't wait, because it could be too late. Because 92% of diabetics, once you become a diabetic, you'll experience diabetic complications. And there's very few, there's only 8% of people who actually don't develop complications. So that is crazy. So Journal of Endocrinology, this is where that study comes from. Okay, did we have some questions coming in?
No, I'm just chatting back and forth. Can you hear me now, actually?
Yeah. I can hear you. You're alive.
I had to go in and go out and shut off my whole system. So sorry, I went dark for a minute there.
No worries. No worries.
I'm here though, and you guys can actually hear me now.
Yay, we can hear Kate. Awesome. So diabetic complications. Once again, not to beat a dead horse, but the key, if you're going to get on top of blood sugar, is to get on top of it right now. Like today is the most important thing you can do today for your overall health is just make sure you've got your blood sugar balanced. And you're saying, what does that mean, Regan? Well, that means getting your exercise in, keeping your stress levels down, making sure you're getting the right foods in, making sure you're fasting. You've got this nice window of time where you're giving your pancreas and liver a break. These are all critical things, because here's what happens. Diabetes, number one cause of diabetic retinopathy, this means blindness, is diabetes. If you want to go blind, the quickest way to do it, well, one of the ways you can do it is diabetes. I think the quickest way would probably be some blunt trauma. Diabetic nephropathy, number one cause of end-stage renal disease is diabetes. Your stroke, chances of having a stroke, which if you've ever met someone who's had a severe stroke, they can't talk. Their motor function, they'll get hemiparesis, so half of their body won't move. Their cognitive function declines. Sometimes your cognitive function is sharp, but you just can't articulate. I mean, it's brutal. So that will increase 2 to 4 times to have a cardiovascular stroke with diabetes. Your cardiovascular disease, 8 in 10 individuals with diabetes die from cardiovascular events. And then diabetic neuropathy. This is the leading cause of non-traumatic lower extremity amputation. So if you want to risk getting a limb amputated, just let your blood sugar go out of control, or just depend on your medications, or not even use your medications, which is even worse. And so one of my friends, I just saw him in Chicago. I was at a medical conference there in June, and I've been working with him on his diabetes about 3 years ago. And I kept telling him, you need to come out again. We need to treat you again. And you've really got to get your blood sugar under control. We had it under control for about 6 months, maybe a year. And he just fell off the wagon. He's like, whatever. He went through a divorce. He's went through massive, stress in his business and career. And then, he ended up getting one of his legs amputated. And Cade, you saw him too at the conference. And just crazy. I mean, totally avoidable. So we don't want to see you get anything amputated. Okay, so just to summarize what we've talked about today. Number one, you got to get the correct diagnostic testing. If you're going to get on top of this, we've got to see where you're at. Without tests, we don't know. We're just playing guessing games with your health. Most of the lab ranges you're using are inaccurate. And so don't trust, if you're at hemoglobin A1C is at a 5.6, your doctor's going to tell you it looks good. A lot of doctors will tell you, well, you're 6.0. As long as you don't go above 6.0, you're fine. What our numbers are is we want you down between 5.0 to 5.3 is our ideal range for your hemoglobin A1C. Most labs don't identify the cause. And so that's one of the reasons we check your C-Peptide, because the C-Peptide actually shows us how active your insulin is. And because you can have good insulin release from the beta cells in your pancreas, maybe your hemoglobin A1C looks okay. But if we start saying, oh, wow, your C-Peptide is really low, that means your insulin is not being utilized and not taking the glucose to the cells. So you're already going into this insulin resistant state. And then we start asking you subjective questions. Do you get hangry? Do you get big surges of endorphins and a big rush after you eat, and then you tank in the afternoon? All these things. The biggest indicator of energy dips and spikes and wanes is blood sugar imbalances. Labs, most of those don't identify these. Functional lab values are more sensitive to reveal the real problem. So once again, here's where the your lab range is 4.0 to 6.5. This is still in the let's wait and see how sick you get before we do anything about your blood sugar. Ours is going to be 4.9 to 5.5. And then we want to get that right down into that 5.0 to 5.3 range, which is perfect. We want to look at your adrenals. Your adrenals and cortisol levels all have a key component when it comes to looking at your blood sugar. And then we look at the insulin, and if you look at the cortisol levels, this is something we can talk about next week because we are coming to a close. But next week, we'll jump into the adrenals and how they relate to blood sugar. We'll give you some meditative things that you can do to balance the adrenals. And then we'll also be talking about gut health and how the gut and the biome in your body actually contributes to blood sugar. So really appreciate you guys being on this today. Thanks for your great questions. And we are having our retreat this Friday, September 6th. And so if you've not signed up for that, we have a few spots left. We've ended up having a big group there, and I can't wait to host you guys. It's going to be a great event. So if you're interested, reach out to Kate or myself at info@gowellness.com.
Yeah. Or you can just call the Salt Lake office and get registered for it. It's going to be an awesome, awesome day. All right. Love you guys. We'll see you same time, same place next week. Thanks so much, Regan.
You got it.
Bye, everybody.
See you guys.